boys and girls, we're going to read chapter 11 and possibly chapter 12. We'll see how much time this takes. I don't want it to be too long for you. Chapter 11. Homily was there at the last gate to meet them. She had tidied her hair and smelled of coal tar soap. She looked younger and somehow excited. "Well," she kept saying, "well," taking the bag from Arrietty and helping Pod to fasten the gate. "Well, was it nice? Were you a good girl? Was the cherry tree out? Did the clock strike?" She seemed in the dim light to be trying to read the expression on Arrietty's face. "Come along now, tea's all ready. Give me your hand." Tea was indeed ready, laid on the round table in the sitting room with a bright fire burning in the cogwheel. How familiar the room seemed, and homey. But suddenly, somehow strange, the firelight flickering on the wallpaper, the line which read, "It would be so charming if what?" Arrietty always wondered. If our house were less dark, she thought, that would be charming. She looked at the homemade dips set in the upturned drawing pins, which Homily had placed as candle holders among the tea things, the old teapot, a hollow oak apple with its quill spout and wired-on handle. Burnished it was now and hard with age. There were 2 roast sliced chestnuts, which they would eat like toast with butter, and a cold boiled chestnut, which Pod would cut like bread. There was a plate of hot dried currants, well plumped before the fire. There were cinnamon bread crumbs, crispy golden and lightly dredged with sugar. And in front of each place, oh, delight of delights, a single potted shrimp. Homily had put out the silver plates, the florin ones for herself and Arrietty, and the half-crown one for Pod. "Come along, Arrietty, if you've washed your hands," exclaimed Homily, taking up the teapot. "Don't dream." Arrietty drew up a cotton spool and sat down slowly. She watched her mother pulling on the spout of the teapot. This was always an interesting moment, the thicker end of the quill being inside the teapot. A slight pull just before pouring would draw it tightly into the hole and thus prevent a leak. If, as sometimes happened, a trace of dampness appeared about the join, it only meant a rather harder pull and a sudden gentle twist. "Well," said Homily, gingerly pouring, "tell us what you saw." "She didn't see much," said Pod, cutting himself a slice of boiled chestnut to eat with his shrimp. "Didn't she see the overmantel?" "No," said Pod, "we never went in the morning room." "Well, what about my blotting paper?" "I never got it," said Pod. "Now that's a nice thing," began Homily. There they are at their table. Can you see that? "Maybe," said Pod, munching steadily, "but I had me feeling. I had it bad." "What's that?" asked Arrietty. "His feeling." "Up the back of his head and in his fingers," said Homily. "It's a feeling your father gets when," she dropped her voice, "there's someone about." "Oh," said Arrietty, and seemed to shrink. "That's why I brought her along home," said Pod. "And was there anyone?" asked Homily anxiously. Pod took a mouthful of shrimp. "Must have been," he said, "but I didn't see nothing." Homily leaned across the table. "Did you have any feeling, Arrietty?" Arrietty started. "Oh," she said, "do we all have it?" "Well, not in the same place," said Homily. "Mine starts at the back of me ankles, and then me knees go. My mother, hers used to start under her chin and run right around her neck, and tied in a bow at the back," said Pod, munching. "No, Pod," protested Homily. "It's a fact. No need to be sarcastic. All the bell pulls were like that. Like a collar, she said it was." "Pity it didn't choke her," said Pod. "Now, Pod, be fair. She had her points." "Points," said Pod. "She was all points." Arrietty moistened her lips. She glanced nervously from Pod to Homily. "I didn't feel anything," she said. "Well," said Homily, "perhaps it was a false alarm." "Oh, no," began Arrietty. "It wasn't." And as Homily glanced at her sharply, she faltered. "I mean, if Papa felt something, I mean, perhaps," she went on, "I don't have it." Well, said Homily, you're young. It'll come, all in good time. You go and stand in our kitchen, just under the chute. When Mrs. Driver's raking out the stove upstairs, she stand right up on the stool or something, so you're fairly near the ceiling. It'll come with practice. After tea, when Pod had gone to his workbench and Homily was washing up, Arrietty rushed to her diary. I'll just open it, she thought, trembling with haste. Anywhere. It fell open the 9th and 10th of July. Talk of camps, but stay at home. Old Cameronian colors in Glasgow Cathedral, 1885. That's what it said for the 9th. And on the 10th, the page was headed, Make hay while the sun shines. Snowdon Peak sold for £5,750,000. Arrietty tore out the last page. Turning it over, she read on the reverse side, July 11th, make not a toil of your pleasure. Niagara passed by C.D. Graham in a cask, 1886. No, she thought, I'll choose the 10th. Make hay while the sun shines. And crossing out her last entry, Mother out of sorts, she wrote below it, Dear Uncle Hendry, I hope you are quite well, and the cousins are well, and Aunt Loopy. We are very well, and I'm learning to borrow. Your loving niece, Arrietty Clock. Write a letter on the back, please. What are you doing, Arrietty? Called Homily from the kitchen. Writing in my diary. Oh, said Homily shortly. Anything you want? Asked Arrietty. It'll do later, said Homily. Arrietty folded the letter and placed it carefully between the pages of Bryce's Tom Thumb, Gazetteer of the World, and in the diary she wrote, Went borrowing, wrote to H, talked to B. After that, Arrietty sat for a long time, staring into the fire and thinking and thinking and thinking. There she is, writing in her diary. Remember, it's so big. She has to lift it. It's heavy. Chapter 12. We'll keep going. But it was one thing to write a letter and quite another to find some means of getting it under the mat. Pod, for several days, could not be persuaded to go borrowing. He was well away on his yearly turnout of the storerooms, mending partitions and putting up new shelves. Arrietty usually enjoyed this spring sorting, when half-forgotten treasures came to light and new ones were discovered for old borrowings. She used to love turning over the scraps of silk or lace, the odd kid gloves, the pencil stubs, the rusty razor blades, the hairpins and the needles, the dried figs, the hazelnuts, the powdery bits of chocolate, and the scarlet stubs of sealing wax. Pod, one year, had made her a hairbrush from a toothbrush, and Homily had made her a small pair of Turkish bloomers from 2 glove fingers for knocking about in the mornings. So bloomers are pants. So she made her pants out of glove fingers. So think of that. That looks like little pants, right? There were spools and spools of colored silks and cottons and small variegated balls of odd wool pen points, which Homily used as flower scoops and bottle tops galore. But this year, Arrietty banged about impatiently and stole away whenever she dared to stare through the grating, hoping to see the boy. She now slept the letter always with her, stuffed inside her jersey, and the edges became rubbed. Once he did run past the grating, and she saw his woolen stockings. He was making a chugging noise in his throat, like some kind of engine, and as he turned the corner, he let out a piercing, ooh, ooh. It was a train whistle, he told her afterwards, so he did not hear her call. One evening, after dark, she crept away and tried to open the first gate, but swing and tug as she might, she could not budge the pin. Arrietty's getting a little brave. Homily, every time she swept the sitting room, would grumble about the carpet. It may be a curtain and chair job, she would say to Pod, but it wouldn't take you not a quarter of an hour with your pen and name tape to fetch me a bit of blotting paper from the desk in the morning room. Anyone would think, looking at this floor, that we lived in a toad hole. No one could come call me house proud, said Homily. You couldn't be, not with my kind of family, but I do like, she said, to keep nice things nice. And at last, on the fourth day, Pod gave in. He laid down his hammer, a small electric bell clapper, and said to Arrietty, "Come along." Arrietty was glad to see the morning room. The door luckily had been left ajar, and it was fascinating to stand at last in the thick pile of the carpet, gazing upward at the shelves and pillars and towering gables of the famous overmantel. So that's where they had lived, she thought. Those pleasure-loving creatures, remote and happy and self-sufficient. She imagined the overmantel women, a little Tweety, Homily had described them, with wasp waists and piled Edwardian hair, swinging carelessly outward on the pilasters, and laughing, gazing at themselves in the inset looking glass, which reflected back to the tobacco jars, the cut glass decanters, the bookshelves, and the plush-covered table. She imagined the overmantel men, fair they were said to be, with long mustaches and nervous, slender hands, telling witty tales, so they had never asked Homily up there. Poor Homily with her bony nose and never tidy hair. They would have looked at her strangely, Arrietty thought, with her long, half-laughing eyes, and smiled a little and humming turned away. And they had lived only on breakfast food, on toast and egg and tiny snips of mushroom, sausage they had had, and crispy bacon and little sips of tea and coffee. Where were they now? Arrietty wondered. Where could these creatures go? Pod had flung his pin so it stuck into the seat of the chair and was up the leg in a trice, leaning outwards on his tape. Then pulling out the pin, he flung it like a javelin above his head into a fold of curtain. This is the moment, Arrietty thought, and felt for her precious letter. She slipped into the hall. It was darker this time, with the front door closed, and she ran across it with a beating heart. The mat was heavy, but she lifted up the corner and slid the letter under by pushing with her foot. There, she said, and looked about her shadows and the ticking clock. She looked across the great plain of floor to where in the distance the stairs mounted. Another world above, she thought, world on world, and she shivered slightly. Arrietty called Pod softly from the morning room, and he ran back in time to see him swing clear of the chair's seat and pull himself upward on the name tape level with the desk. Lightly, he came down feet apart, and she saw him, for safety's sake, twist the name tape lightly round his wrist. I wanted you to see that, he said a little breathless. The blotting paper, when he pushed it, floated down quite softly, riding lightly on the air, and lay at last some feet beyond the desk, pink and fresh on the carpet's dingy pile. You start rolling, whispered Pod. I'll be down. And Arrietty went on her knees and began to roll the blotting paper until it grew too stiff for her to hold. Pod soon finished it off and lashed it with his name tape, through which he ran his hat pin, and together they carried the long cylinder as two house painters would carry a ladder, under the clock and down the hole. Homily hardly thanked them. When, panting a little, they dropped the bundle in the passage outside the sitting-room door. She looked alarmed. Oh, there you are, she said. Thank goodness. That boy's about again. I've just heard Mrs. Driver talking to Crampfurl. Oh, cried Arrietty. What did he say? And Homily glanced sharply at her and saw that she looked pale. Arrietty realized she should have said, What boy? It was too late now. Nothing real bad, Homily went on, as though to reassure her. It's just a boy that they have upstairs. It's nothing at all. But I heard Mrs. Driver say that she'd take a slipper to him, see if he had the mats up once again in the hall. The mats up in the hall? Echoed Arrietty. Yes, 3 days running, she said to Crampfurl. He'd had the mats up in the hall. She could tell, she said, by the dust and the way he'd pulled them back. It was the hall part that worried me. Seeing as you and your father... What's the matter, Arrietty? There's no call for that sort of face. Come on now, help me move the furniture, and we'll get down the carpet. So having the mats up doesn't mean that he like rolled them up and tipped them against the wall. It just means that she could tell that he moved them and he would be looking for her letter, right? That's why the mats had been up. Oh dear, thought Arrietty miserably as she helped her mother empty the matchbox chest of drawers. 3 days running he's looked and nothing there. He'll give up hope now. He'll never look again. That evening she stood for hours on a stool under the chute in the kitchen, pretending she was practicing to get a feeling when she really was listening to Mrs. Driver's conversations with Crampfurl. All she learned was that Mrs. Driver's feet were killing her, and that it was a pity that she hadn't given in her notice last May, and would Crampfurl have another drop, considering there was more in the cellar than anyone would ever drink in their lifetime. And if they thought she was going to clean the first floor windows single-handed, they had better think again. But on the third night, just as Arrietty had climbed down off the stool before she overbalanced with weariness, she heard Crampfurl say, "If you ask me, I'd say he had a ferret." And quickly Arrietty climbed back again, holding her breath. "A ferret!" she heard Mrs. Driver exclaim shrilly. "Whatever next? Where would he keep it?" "That I wouldn't like to say," said Crampfurl in his rumbling, earthy voice. "All I know is I was up beyond Parkin's Beck, going round all the banks and calling like down all the rabbit holes." There's Mrs. Driver and Crampfurl. "Well, I never," said Mrs. Driver. "Where's your glass?" "Just a drop," said Mr. Crampfurl. "That's enough. Goes to your liver, the sweet stuff. Not like beer, it isn't." Remember, they do grown-up drinks. "Yes," he went on. "When he saw me coming with a gun, he pretended to be cutting a stick like from the hedge. But I'd see him all right, and heard him calling away, his nose down a rabbit hole. It's my belief he's got a ferret." There was a gulp, as though Crampfurl was drinking. "Yes," he said at last, and Arrietty heard him set down the glass. "A ferret called Uncle Something." So, you know that they think he has a ferret because the boy is going out and hollering down all the holes, which is what he would say to try, what he said he would do to try to find Uncle Henry. Arrietty made a sharp movement, balanced for one moment with arms waving, and fell off the stool. There was a clatter as the stool slid sideways, banged against a chest of drawers, and rolled over. "What was that?" asked Crampfurl. There was a silence upstairs, and Arrietty held her breath. "I didn't hear nothing," said Mrs. Driver. "Yes," said Crampfurl. "It was under the floor like, there by the stove." "That's nothing," said Mrs. Driver. "It's the coals falling. Often sounds like that. Scares you sometimes when you're sitting here alone. Here, pass your glass. There's only a drop left. Might as well finish the bottle." They're drinking fine old Madeira, thought Arrietty, and very carefully she set the stool upright and stood quietly beside it, looking up. She could see light through the crack, occasionally nicked with a shadow as one person or another moved a hand or arm. "Yes," went on Crampfurl, returning to his story, "and when I come up with my gun, all innocent-like, to put me off, I shouldn't wonder." "Any old badger sets around here?" "Artful," said Mrs. Dryer. That means that she thinks he's clever, trying to get Crampfurl to help him. "The things they think of, badger sets," and she gave her creaking laugh. "As a matter of fact," said Crampfurl, "there did used to be one, but when I showed him where it was like, he didn't take no notice of it, just stood there waiting for me to go." Crampfurl laughed. "Two can play that game," I thought, so I just sit myself down, and there were the two of us." "And what happened?" "Well, he had to go off in the end, leaving his ferret. I waited a bit, but it never came out. I poked around a bit and whistled. Pity I never heard properly what he called it. Uncle Something, it sounded like." Arrietty heard the sudden scrape of a chair. "Well," said Crampfurl, "I'd better get on now and shut up the chickens." The scullery door banged, and there was a sudden clatter overhead as Mrs. Driver began to rake the stove. Arrietty replaced the stool and stole softly into the sitting room, where she found her mother alone. Tomorrow will be chapter 13.